plow through 25 minutes of a presentation, and then hopefully we can have a conversation. So let me pull up my screen, confirm that this works, and we'll go from there. Can you all see? Thumbs up, great. So a couple just preliminary points. If you hear 2 6-year-olds in the background, that's from me. So it's kind of an odd time at 6 o'clock. You never know between the 6 and 7 hours. So they're occupied with dinner now. So hopefully it won't be too disruptive, but we make it a pop-in. And the other thing to acknowledge is that in talking about kind of place activation and retail at this moment in time, it's a hard thing. And, it's particularly hard, but also particularly important for 2 reasons. One is we're in the middle, or maybe not even in the middle. We're at the beginning of a pandemic. And I say beginning of the pandemic because we've got a long way to go here. The way in which this pandemic has impacted our world, the way in which we think about urban places, the way in which we think about people gathering and retail is, it touches everything we do at Graffito. And I think the other piece that touches everything we're trying to do better at Graffito is how do we become a more anti-racist business? And we should have been talking about this a year ago and 5 years ago and 10 years ago. But like many of you, we've kind of been awakened, I would say, to our need to do way better as practitioners to create more inclusive, just, interesting, vibrant, diverse urban places. So I wanted to start just by addressing those 2 things because we can't really talk about retail and placemaking without understanding, I don't want to say understanding these things, but at least acknowledging the contours of these very, very pressing social realities. So I'm going to dive in a little bit to who we are, what we work on, and how we approach projects, and then share with you all a little bit of what we're seeing out there, what our major takeaways are, which are certainly guiding the way in which we're thinking about the development of urban places. Our sweet spot is really thinking about the first 20 vertical feet of the neighborhoods we work in. Talk a lot about ground floor activation. We'll get into what we mean by that because it's not just 1, 2, or 3 things, as all of you know, particularly you planners. And I think it's also worth acknowledging that the evolution of our company is really interesting, but it started with a really heavy transactional focus. And over time, we realized that we couldn't just focus on transactions, we had to focus on development. And we couldn't just focus on development, we had to focus on planning. And we couldn't just focus on planning, we had to focus on storytelling. So our team has evolved, it's 8 of us. We've got a planner, we've got some brokers, we've got somebody who works in community economic development and community engagement. We've got a graphic designer and a creative director. So the look of our business is really different than what it looked like at inception and even looked at like 5 years after we started. But I think it's reflective of the places that we all work, that many of us work, challenging urban environments that, need to be understood in a very multidisciplinary way. So, our sweet spot is really working for institutional landowners and being their counselors as they think about creating place. So here's some pictures. We work at various different scales. I don't think George is on this call, but we've been working with George and his team in Somerville on the master plan for Union Square, Somerville on behalf of the master developer. We've done a lot of work in Cambridge. We're currently working on a really interesting project, which is the Harbor Garage, now called Pinnacle, which is the picture on the top. And we're also working in Worcester on some properties adjacent to the ballpark. And we've been doing a lot of work, particularly with Harvard in Alston, Brighton over the last 5 years. There is a piece of our business that touches retailers on their side of the table. We work for a small handful of retailers and we do their real estate work. One is on the top left-hand side, which is Tate Bakery. We've been working with Sarit since her first bakery in Brookline. And it's a really interesting thing for us to be able to understand the tenant perspective. And I think that's what makes us good at what we do, is to translate between our clients and partners and, bakers and chefs and artists and fitness instructors and shopkeepers is the only way we can be successful, right? Is effectively moving that translation forward. And, in the markets that we're in, Cambridge, Boston, Somerville, and beyond, the majority of the decision makers and the actors are white males like me. And I think going back to my earlier point, to create more interesting and inclusive spaces is going to require a diverse set of actors. So that's one area we're really looking on improving our translation, right? Super critical, spending a ton of time on that. But I think the roots of our company, as Dennis can probably speak to based on our work in Cambridge, has really been about how do we connect small local owner operated businesses with really large institutional neighborhood scale developers. So to do that, we've been circulating a version of this slide for over 10 years, and it's evolved. And the evolution has been as follows. Graffito started really focused on the deal making, the activation, the leasing. And, as I spoke about when I mentioned our team, we slowly started going backwards in time, realizing that impact, we have to kind of really enter very early. We have to start to define and understand the story we're telling about typically existing places, right? We're not fabricating places, we're building off what's already there. And from there, if our point of entry is trying to understand the existing context, it makes it a lot easier for us to think about environment building and just the kind of blocking and tackling of real estate development. And that's what allows us to get to this last phase, which is often why people come to us, which is how do we activate this place? But the real lesson here is that you can't really activate the place without understanding it, right? And part of that understanding is understanding the contours of the municipality you're in, is understanding the kind of existing characters that are in that place. And I think we bring that perspective, which is unfortunately somewhat unique. And, knowing that many of you are planners, when I started in this business, it was kind of astounding to me, the disconnect between the super creative, planners and creative professionals and architects, and then the folks doing the transactions. And the amount of information and frankly, the values and the goals that were lost in that translation was pretty astounding. So we're trying to kind of fill that gap. And one of the ways we fill that gap is through thinking holistically about what makes a good place, right? Like Logan and Russ and her team at Principal know this really well, but we started kind of not as planners, but as developers working on retail. And over time, we realized what you all know, it's super obvious, you can't just make a good place with just retail. So our practice has been thrust into space that we weren't originally working on. And it's particularly significant today because some of these things, civic and cultural in particular, public art and entertainment, these are the uses that are going to be occupying our retail space in the future. It is worth noting right now, we have way too much ground floor square footage in the state, in the city, in arguably every municipality in the Commonwealth, right? We've overbuilt retail. Municipalities come in and say every single square foot of ground floor space should be retail. They should be saying it should be active use, right? Some cities, Somerville as an example, is getting better at that. But we got too much retail, right? And not only that, the footprint that retailers are taking today is shrinking because, as I'll get into in one of the later slides, there's no real such thing as inventory anymore, right? Like, even if you're not drop shipping to customers, I can assure you that most retailers that are selling sneakers or clothing or gifts, they're getting shipments on a daily or weekly basis. You go back 20 years ago, it was quarterly. So it's changed the way in which people use real estate, and footprints are shrinking and we have too much real estate. So when we think about the pandemic, and we can't ignore this right now, I wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking about what's going on right now, right? And how this is impacting our practice. I also recognize I just took you through like 10 years of history of how we got here as a company. I think much of it probably resonates with you all. I'm, of course, happy to go back to it, but I think the slides that come, these next 3 slides, are really about where do we go from here, what's happening now, kind of the meat of the presentation. So what we're seeing right now in our space is these are the elements that are creating good place, right? It's not going back. It's not really our seating and our lighting and our wayfinding, all really important. I mean, you could argue environmental graphics are more important today than ever, but it's these things, right? I don't have my own car, right? I moved from Cambridge to Newtonville, and we chose this community because we thought we could make it as a family of 4 with 1 car. But the reality is today, vehicular centricity, if you're a retailer or a real estate developer, in the very near term is really important. It's a very scary thing to see people make decisions based on that today, because I'm really hopeful, as I'm sure many of you are, that we're going to get back to where we were a year ago, which is trying to find ways of creating networks in our city that are not about vehicular transportation. But the retailers that are successful, not only have parking, they have loading. They have figured out ways of navigating the tensions in cities, between bike lanes and sidewalks and loading areas to get goods in and out of their space. And the folks that are successful right now, whether it's restaurants with outdoor dining or retailers with curbside pickup, they've figured out a much better way of using their edges, right? That's hypercritical. And the other one I highlighted on here is, the folks that are doing, and by the way, this isn't just retailers. I think this is municipalities. These are bids. These are community organizations. The folks that are doing a good job communicating with consumers and users, this even goes to the folks that are using public spaces, are the ones that are having some success. And success today is defined by safety, right? Are the ones that are actually having folks that are using their spaces and their places and coming to their shops. So those are the two biggies here. I'd also say, one of the things that we're seeing is it's never been more important to be in a residential-centric mixed-use district, right? The central business districts right now are getting absolutely crushed. There aren't any humans. It is a really, really challenging thing right now for developers in those spaces. It's a really, really challenging thing for retailers in those spaces. Many of you might have seen the article in the Globe this morning about restaurants that are, quote, hibernating for the winter. The three neighborhoods where they're hibernating, Fenway, Kendall, and Back Bay, one of the reasons is they've lost their daytime population in those districts. And many of those districts were reliant on daytime lunch, and they were reliant on evening, I'll call it entertainment uses and private events, right? There's no doubt, corporate spending. So that's gone, and that's really significant. And I think the neighborhood scale places that are in residential districts are able to make it. No one's really, other than pharmacy and grocery and a few others, I wouldn't say there are many folks that are thriving, but there are some folks that are surviving. So the shifts that we're seeing today, and I'm going to focus a little bit on retail because this is so much at the core and essence of what we do at Graffito. And, as you saw from the prior slides, the evolution of our company flowed from being really focused on retail and how do we build communities and neighborhoods that can support retail. The biggie here is the second to last bullet. We have seen what was expected to be anywhere from 3 years in the most aggressive case to 8 years in the most conservative case of movement from brick and mortar spending to online. We saw that 3 to 8 year period go into like 3 to 5 months. It is remarkable the shift that has occurred. All the data supports it. And I think it's why this is so significant isn't because it's a near-term phenomenon that's going to go away. I have a 70-year-old father who never pre-pandemic, and probably if it wasn't for the pandemic for the rest of his life, would have never bought a pair of shoes online. Guess what? He bought a pair of shoes online. And guess what? It was really easy. And I'm not sure he'll ever go back to a store. So we can't really turn back from there. Right? And it's across generations. And that it will have a major, major impact on retail. The other thing that's right in front of us that, many of you know this, but I have to reiterate it, is the worst has yet to come when it comes to retail and restaurant closings. This winter, I believe, will be catastrophic. Many folks who've been hanging on will not be able to hang on. And again, I hope I'm wrong. I don't think we will be wrong about this. The major shifts that are occurring that, again, the mall was kind of on its way out. The mall is effectively dead. We are seeing, both some of our clients and partners and, other folks that work in this space, we're seeing malls being used as schools, as hospitals, as, last mile manufacturing facilities. The change with malls and big box retail is happening right now, and there's no turning back from it. The other thing that we're keeping an eye on, which I do not believe will be as permanent, but it's acute pain right now, and I mentioned before, is central business districts, right? Our top, the cities that everybody looked to, everyone who wanted to call himself an innovation district, right? And they were chasing all those tech employees, and they were throwing up as fast as they could office density. Those districts are challenged right now. Very, very challenged. And again, I think people will come back, but there's going to be some stickiness of the change that's come. And, the last thing I would say on this page, because I think it's implied, and I'm going to assume everyone understands the impact to restaurants and entertainment and recreation uses, because we all kind of, some of us, I would say most of us have experienced it in some way or another firsthand. We're starting to see an evolution of the way in which consumers are spending money. And we're starting to see rapid rate change in where they're spending money, what their preferences are. You know, one of the things that gives us great optimism, and we're hopeful that it's enduring, is the way in which many consumers have shifted their spending to Black-owned businesses. And, you know, I do not think this is a trend. I think this is something that for many consumers, particularly young consumers, is just one very, very, very tiny way that they can vote a little bit more with their dollars. And, you know, we see that continuing to be something that is not only noteworthy, but I think will make it easier for many of us in the real estate development community who are going to have to change the way in which we look at deal making from a barriers of entry perspective, and change the way in which we advocate with our investors, our lenders, again, who are largely controlled and dominated by white men who may not be as sensitive to some of these issues as we are and haven't really been enlightened. I think one of the arguments we'll be able to make is the shift that folks, Black, white, and brown, are making towards trying to spend more dollars in businesses that are female and minority owned. It's already something we're talking about to justify the viability of businesses that have been left behind by the last, you know, however many hundreds of years of real estate development in this country. So again, I recognize this is a lot. I wanted to end quickly, and I'm trying to end by 6:30, so I think I'm gonna be okay here. I wanted to end with just a few things that we're looking at. And we're as a firm really fascinated in, and we're talking to our partners about. The first one for you urban designers and architects is no surprise. It's how do we rethink the tensions in our cities that are going to exist between needs of retailers, even needs of residential developers that are now taking 20 plus Amazon deliveries a day, right? How do we think about the curb? How do we think about the edge? When more people start coming back to the office and driving, when our bus routes resume to full capacity and they're actually stopping at bus stops because more people are riding, when people are continuing to bike more and more, when we have more people on the street, and to my earlier point, like the edge is so critical for retail, how do we balance that? And that's going to be really, really, really challenging. You know, some of our most vibrant urban places, like I think about Central Square in Cambridge, an area Dennis knows really well, and I've spent a lot of time working on. You've got bus lanes, you've got bike lanes, you've got loading zones, you've got metered parking, you've got pedestrians, and then you have all the stuff that happens in the buildings. So that's going to be challenging, and we're going to have to figure it out. The other thing we're spending a lot of time thinking about is the municipal perspective, right? For all you city planners, there's been 10 years of must be retail on the ground floor, must be retail on the ground floor. Well, what happens when there's not enough retail to go on the ground floor? How do we redefine what we want on the ground floor of these mixed use buildings and start to talk about active uses as opposed to talking about just retail uses? And certain municipalities have gotten there. You know, in our work in Somerville, we, through the neighborhood planning process, came up with a concept called, you know, ACE uses, arts and creative enterprise uses. You know, Logan, Russ was very much involved in this. I think you may have as well. You know, there are going to be a set of uses that are appropriate for the ground floor, that are active, that are beautiful, that promote safety and vibrancy, that are not retail. And there are going to be a whole nother set of things, civic uses, housing, that I think we're going to have to relook at retrofitting some of our retail spaces. And I think for many developers, like this is a scary thing. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity. And, you know, I'd also say we're going to have to think about right-sizing our retail spaces too. For any of you who like coffee and live in Boston, we did a demonstration project with our own office. This is going back to 2013, where we took a space that was up 3 feet from the street in the Leather District, as many of the storefronts are, and was previously a closed off yoga studio. And we decided to put our office in that space. But we couldn't put our office on the street front. It didn't feel right. And, you know, we did an experiment where we carved off the front 220 square feet and we put a coffee bar in it. That coffee bar is still there today. It's called Grace Note. It's really a wonderful place. This is not a plug for them. But, you know, we did as a demonstration project, something that showed, you know, you've got 1,800 square feet that is really not viable for retail, but, you know, we can certainly use the 1,500 square feet for our office, but we need to do something highly active on that edge in a district that really had very little retail. And we put a 220 square foot coffee bar in there that did 600 grand in sales, right? You know, and has been wildly successful. And by the way, I don't know that they would have done that much more in sales had we actually given them the whole space. So that idea of right sizing is really, really critical. And just kind of the way in which we think about just demising our existing retail spaces. We're thinking a lot about retail real estate valuation, right? I think retail real estate's a liability for many institutional investors. For many of you who are actively developing projects with a lot of ground floor retail, you're probably really nervous. You know, what do we put here? And my gut is to justify the land costs and development costs of the last 5 years, your underwriting is probably way off for your retail, right? And at the end of the day, you know, every performer is going to have to be adjusted. And I'm really curious what that does to retail real estate valuations, what that does to cap rates in the retail space. I do believe that A+ retail locations will remain leasable and in high demand. I personally worry about those B and C locations from a retail perspective. And then the last one, you know, just to put out there, particularly for this group, many of our contemporaries and many of the folks in our space that are working on place activation, that are working on retail projects, all the buzz right now is like the emergence of the suburbs, right? Like, this is it. Like, it's all shifting back. People are moving. We don't buy it. You know, the future of our company is going to be really leaning in and continuing to work on projects that are connected to mass transit in mixed-use urban environments, right? We're super committed to it. We think there's going to be some real pain, but we think there's tremendous opportunity. And, you know, it's been a really interesting thing for us over the last 3 months, as people have moved on from like complete frozen in panic mode to now, okay, we think we got this figured out. One of the major takeaways is people talking about just how well stuff's doing in the suburbs. The reality is that stuff in the suburbs, excuse me, is not doing nearly as well as it was pre-pandemic, but it's just not getting absolutely crushed like some of the stuff in the city. And that goes for events, that goes for programs, that goes for daycare centers, that goes for, you know, restaurants, obviously. So we're going to really remain committed to cities. I'm sure many of you have the same philosophy as I do by nature of this group and this organization. But it's certainly not a given. So last page, you know, graphic designer made sure to put something cute here. So there's a thank you and a prompt for questions. Happy to go back to any of this. I know I went super fast, and I know particularly in the slide set between, you know, pages 7, 8, 9, there was a lot there. But surely really hard to fully unpack this conversation in an hour. But happy to spend the next half hour kind of talking with you all.
Awesome. Thank you, Jesse. That was great. And one of the questions that I had written down that Sharon also asked in the chat was, could you please talk a little bit more about non-retail and active uses on the ground floor? So you kind of gave that example of right sizing and putting a coffee bar, but, you know, what else can people do? And what exactly do you mean by active uses as opposed to retail uses on the ground floor?
Yeah, it's a great question. So most retail is active use, right? But when we think about non-retail active uses, let's see if I got some imagery in here. I'm not sure. Yeah, there's a good picture in here somewhere. Hang on. So for example, when we think about non-retail active uses, this on the bottom right is a podcast studio project we did 4 years ago in North Allston as part of our project with Harvard. It's open to the public. You can go and report a podcast studio. There's a community space in it. And it's also connected to where we had a beer garden space, where we had a rotating space for programs, but there are no retail leases there, right? So, you know, part of it is, all right, let's assume that a retailer restaurateur can't come in. How do we find uses that are activating, that have some benefit to the community, but, you know, aren't the places where you're going in and having kind of instantaneous commerce happening like you do in retail. You're buying a sweater, you're buying sneakers, you're buying a gift or a plant, etc. So the list that we've developed, and I'll actually post, we just have a blog post on this, I'll post it to chat, you know, 10 categories. Some are less active than others. For example, civic uses, I would argue that libraries are super active and museums are super active. They're certainly not retail. Housing, you know, I do not think housing is an active use. But, you know, you can look at some of the development or existing housing infrastructure in the South End or in places like Brooklyn, and you can understand how a place like Tremont Street or Washington Street or Columbus, you know, it has a lot of housing on the ground floor of these major urban, you know, thoroughfares. So housing's one, educational uses would be another, you know, maker spaces, co-working, creative office, medical. You know, we're not afraid right now of thinking about creative office on the ground floor. Our studio currently remains in the Leather District. We just did a project with a local arts organization to kind of put stencil our entire front. It's really quite beautiful and very cool with public art. So, you know, again, our space wasn't leasable for retail, but we still wanted to add some color and some beauty to it. So there are a lot of these uses, again, that I think are active. It may only be going in with a, you know, little pocket gallery, right? 5 feet into the space. But I think it is really important we still think about how we activate that edge. I think it's really important the pedestrian experience. And again, it doesn't have to necessarily be retail. Did that answer, Sharon, your question?
I think that leads.
Yes, a little bit. Just for some context, I'm on the planning board here in Mansfield, and my next question that I also included, Logan, you might be getting to it, is some experience with TOD, because we have a really emerging TOD, and we have lots of problems now with the traditional retail on the first floor with brand new mixed use buildings, and the investors are saying that they can't fill the space and they can't get anybody to fill the space because of A, B, C, and D. So I was interested in your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, Sharon. I mean, really quickly, you know, any hard retail space, the usual script from developers is just too hard. I can't fill it, A, B, C, and D. They've just got to be more creative, period. You know, I think that ultimately there is an active use that can go into that space, and these mixed use buildings on transit nodes, you know, I'm almost of the opinion, similar to what in Somerville, you know, every office isn't the same. And the idea of having creative office and having permeable windows and storefronts and lit storefronts, even if it is office, like that's critical. I even think the kind of office user is something to think about. But yeah, we certainly have a lot of experience in those districts. You know, I think the big question would be, what's a reality now, Sharon, versus what's a reality in a year and a half, and making sure you're not planning and making concessions as a municipality because of the pain that's being suffered right now, because some of it long-term implications, but some of it is not going to be, we're not always going to be in this situation.
Thank you.
Jesse, I'm just going to jump through the questions just a bit because Andre just had a follow-up question to Sharon's. So I'm just going to skip a few questions and then we're just going to go back to some of the other ones. But his question was, many of the alternate uses that you mentioned are active, but not 18 are active or even 12 are active. So how do you get the desired safety and vibrancy? And I'm just wondering, would you like to leave your presentation on, or should we go into a gallery chat format just so everyone can see and have a comment? Okay, that's great. Thanks.
You know, it's interesting. 18 hours is hard. There's no doubt. You know, most restaurants aren't 18 hours. Movie theaters aren't 18 hours. I mean, like so many of the retail uses, you know, if you can get 18 hours, 7 days a week, that's an amazing thing. There are very few districts in Massachusetts that actually do a great job with that. There are some, right? 12 hours would be great too. So I think the essence of the question though is some of these active uses are not truly that active. I think that's the point. And, you know, there's no doubt about it. I mean, I think the way in which we like to think about how do you mitigate the reality that if you define active by the flow of human beings in and out of the door, right? Regular flow and movement, which I think is many people's definite kind of subjective definition of activity. If you put that aside for a second, just think about color and light and beauty as being active and being additive to neighborhoods. It does change the definition of active. And I also think, you know, so oftentimes, you know, we're in districts where people talk about maker uses, co-working, fabricator, all this stuff that's trending, that, which by the way, I don't think is going away, and they suggest that's active. Well, is it really active? So I think it's similar, you know, my answer to this question, which is a great way of not answering it thoroughly, is I think to create truly active storefronts in pedestrian, scaled, and centric neighborhoods, it's about a lot more to make the space interesting 18 hours, as opposed to just focusing on like activity and humans in 18 hours. Because I think that's a hard thing. I'm not sure if that's what you were driving at, but that's my best way of walking around the answer for you. I can see the questions now.
Yeah, I guess that leads me, I kind of wrote this down while you were talking, but I think it's a good segue. You know, it's good advice to be more creative to fill a vacant space, but are there things that, you know, developers or municipalities can do in the interim when they have spaces closed down? I know anecdotally you walk around and see kind of storefronts boarded up in my neighborhood and it's pretty depressing. Is there something that you would are advising your clients to do in the interim to kind of make sure that it's not just boarded up, empty storefront space?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the first one is don't board it up. Put something of value in the window, whether it's information graphics. We're working on a project right now that we hope to go live with soon, which is taking a bunch of new construction retail that is not going to be leased anytime soon for a slew of different reasons, and actually putting up advertisements for other restaurants in that district with QR codes, right? So like, how do you then drive folks to help them understand other restaurants in this district are open and they're struggling? Oh, and by the way, here's a way of ordering off their website, boom, with your phone, right? That will be one example. And, you know, I think it's really hard right now. It's just not safe to gather inside. So what we normally would have said to do with interim uses and temporary uses and working with community groups, I don't think that's something we can safely do right now, right? So our toolbox is a lot more limited today. But assuming we get to a place maybe next summer where we can all start to gather, you know, where we immediately would look and where we coach a lot of our developer clients and partners is there's a certain amount of make safe and make usable space that can often be done. It's oftentimes cheaper for the developer to do it, to quote, you know, white box the space, to at least make those spaces usable for folks, right? And I think ultimately, for those of us that are working, consulting with, and you know, many of the developers on this call can probably attest to this, a lot of it just fundamentally comes down to the economics. You know, how do you afford for 2 years to bring in a neighborhood group to do something really cool when you've got bank financing and you underwrote that space at $30 triple net? And I think that's where the rubber meets the road, because there may not be that $30 triple net tenant for a long time. I would say though, we found that the way to get that tenant is to bring some energy to a space and to demonstrate that people will come there, right? So, I mean, our middle ground has always been, look, the only thing worse than never getting a tenant, you know, is just sitting here and waiting for one to come, right? And at the end of the day, I think there are some kind of, you know, a lot of people talk about pop-ups, you know, I think there are a whole bunch of ways that you can activate spaces in the interim, and we've had a lot of success with that.
Great. It looks like there's a question from Aaron. I don't know if Aaron, you want to turn your mic on and ask, or I can read the question.
Yeah, I can ask the question. So I'm representing kind of the suburban area and the 128 area. where there's kind of this whole debate about vertical housing, and I realize how important it is because of the housing shortage. So I would just like to know what your thoughts are on that and how you address that, because someone that does live in a small town, people don't want that. But also, you were saying the retail also has to change on the first floor, and I'm kind of a big proponent as you can have the vertical housing as long as you have the retail on the first floor. So I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer the first question. I have my own personal beliefs. I'm not sure they're expert beliefs about talking about vertical housing. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm very much in favor of density on transit for environmental reasons. And the other reason that people don't, for those of us that want to support our local economies and communities and retailers, we need density. We need it. So, the way in which we approach it in an area that we are, I think, an expert, as opposed to advocating for against NIMBYism, is that, the health of our districts on the ground floor require density, right? The most vibrant places have density. And, for retailers to succeed, I have family that owns restaurants, right? I have all my closest friends are in retail. Like we need people, right? So, that's probably the best answer I can give without getting the politics of housing. And I certainly, of course, have my own personal beliefs. The second part of your question, I do still advise planning for retail on the ground floor, but not everywhere, right? Definitely not everywhere. But, I do think it's got to be a lot more holistic in thinking about a slew of different ground floor active uses when retail is just one tool. And, I think that there are also I think this goes back to Andre's question. There are also certain corners that it's way more critical to have retail and have life and have it lit. I mean, we've had many projects where we've deliberately worked with our clients and said, look, we need somebody that's open breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? We can accomplish that on one corner, 18 hours, 7 days, but to accomplish that on district scale is really challenging. So look, in the right locations, our business depends on it. I'm still very, very optimistic retail is going to work. I just don't think it's going to work everywhere. And by the way, that's not a pandemic reaction. This was true in 2019.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Totally.
I think Russ has a question. Russ, do you want to turn on your mic?
Yeah, thanks, Logan. Jesse, thank you so much for giving time to us tonight. I know how busy you are these days. I think, first off, a plug for Jesse and Graffito. These guys pivoted really hard into trying to communicate about what was going on when the pandemic hit. So, like, virtual applause, all that effort you guys put into this. It was a great resource for not just myself, but tons of colleagues I know. So, with that said, though, I think you guys, are looking into the future pretty quickly compared to some folks who are still trying to react to this. And I've been thinking about three things that I wanted to see, where you might be thinking this is going as well. Like, first off, Boston was kind of slow to take back the street. The fact that the parklets, did emerge later in the summer, or Somerville did this as well. I think we're seeing that trend, something that we've been advocating for 10 plus years now, like, happen in an instant. So I think part of this question is, what can we do policy-wise to make sure that becomes the norm? Because, a lot of what you talked about was how the importance of the public realm and the activation of the space outside of the buildings is actually what brings meaningful value to the occupants of those ground floors. So that's one thing I'm thinking about, is how do we do that? Second is, the winter in New England is going to be deadly for restaurants and for active ground floor uses that require foot traffic. I mean, just this week, we talked to two of our tenants, a coffee shop and a restaurant. One's going to go dark for the winter. The other is trying to figure out rent relief. And so I think the landscape of the ground floor activity use is going to radically change this winter. So what can we do from a placemaking standpoint to take back the street in the winter? And if you've heard any creative ideas around that. And then I think the final part of this is, at a policy level, I've been thinking a lot about how we got to this point, and I keep going back to the Italian piazza and the sort of fact that there's these European traditions around urbanism that were perhaps emerged out of pandemics? And like, what can we learn that can help inform us as urban designers and as placemakers to start to advocate for better people-oriented places around squares, around streets, so that we can have a more flexible public realm that can adapt to these types of situations again? And I think those are all kind of clustered around this like lack of understanding of how we have to let the public realm be dynamic. And I'm just wondering if you guys have been thinking ahead about, you know, what we can do next for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Russ, you nailed 3 areas we're certainly thinking a lot about. So the first one, I'll go relatively quickly through, but you know, where we're at as a firm, and we talk about this no less than 10 hours a week together, stuff like this. As it relates to kind of grabbing the public realm, from a policy perspective, which I think was the question, we don't actually see there being, we see the real bottleneck in the near term, not necessarily being policy, because we see the electeds on board with this. It's actually the competition, the tension between like public works and the fire departments and the policymakers, you know, and, you know, things like snowplows and the fire departments basically saying, you know, for example, in Boston, you know, you can't keep a propane tank 10 feet. You have to keep it 10 feet outside of the envelope of a building. And by the way, you can't keep it on city land. Where are you going to store it? And you can't store it at night. So like, that doesn't work. Fire department, right? You know, so I think the battle in the short term is actually with folks at public works, facilities, fire. That's my sense. I'm more optimistic that we'll come out of this with some pretty decent policy. I'm very concerned we're just not gonna be able to move quickly enough for winter 2020-21, right? That's my biggest concern. Speaking of the winter, you know, I'm in the minority on this. I haven't eaten at a restaurant since March for a bunch of reasons. I don't think it's a super safe environment for restaurant workers right now. And, you know, I feel uncomfortable with the way in which other customers are behaving inside. And, you know, I'm a huge proponent that we should not be pushing people to go to restaurants. We should be pushing people for takeout. To your point about your restaurateurs that are struggling, like we should be advocating super aggressively for people to tip 20% and take the food away, right? And we should be advocating really aggressively for curbside, but we're not doing that in Boston. And I think because of our winters, that's going to be the downfall of a lot of retailers because it's the windiest city in America, right? This is the windiest city in America. People are not going to dine outside. You know, some will, but it's going to be hard, right? And by the way, you can't even find a heater right now. You know, the article in the Globe today mentioned, you know, somebody we work with closely who's closing, you couldn't even find heaters. So I think in the winter, long story short, Russ, we got to push people to still buy local. And we've got to work with municipalities on loading areas and pull-off areas and figure out a way of advocating for off-premise dining and takeaway shopping. And by the way, it's not just locals. Like I think Walmart just announced they're hiring 3,000 more people specifically for their curbside program because Target and Walmart are smart enough to realize that, you know, it's actually a much better model for them if people are willing to do curbside than sending this stuff all over the globe, you know, all over in these boxes, right? And then the last one on the kind of taking some inspiration from European plaza concept, we've talked about this before, I think. The major takeaway for us right now is retail development of the future is going to have to be more square-like and clustered, right? Like the idea that you just throw 5,000 square feet here, 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 and here on this like 40-acre site. I give the Cambridge Crossing, you know, the North Point example. When we joined that team in 2014, you know, we went back to the city and we said, we're going to do 120,000 square feet of retail, not 300. It had been permitted for 300. And we're going to concentrate it all towards the core of the site along First Street in the Green Line. And I think moving forward, excuse my son screaming. I think moving forward, we're going to see that level of clustering and we're going to see restaurateurs realize they want to actually be able to share the use of public space and do it in places where people are comfortable dining en masse. So I share your optimism. I think we're going to get back there pretty quickly. I hope.
I hope so too. Thanks, Jesse. One more plug. Everyone should subscribe to Jesse's podcast. It's very good.
Thanks, Russ. I'll put a link here. It's nice to have someone else plugging your work, by the way. This is great. I'm going to show up at Russ's next talk.
So we have some time left. Does anybody else want to turn on their mic and ask a question?
Dennis had a juicy question about cannabis I saw there.
All right, go ahead.
Let me find it again.
Well, I have many questions, as I always do when I sit down with you, Jesse, and I thank you for doing this. Cannabis is a big concern in that much local retail fears it, even though it'll bring people in. And there's now a proposal for a cannabis shop to open right on one of the few open spaces in Harvard Square. And I've proposed what you suggested with the coffee shop, not that we need another coffee shop, but some active use fronting on it. Your thoughts on how cannabis shops help or distract from an attractive retail area?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the cannabis shop. You know, it's no different than, you know, there are certain drinking establishments that are better or worse for neighborhoods, right? So I think just like with any retail, it really comes down to the operator, right? It comes down to really good design. You know, I for one right now am of the opinion that anything that brings human beings to a neighborhood is a good thing, right? You know, I think there's still a real stigma. I mean, I think we can all acknowledge this around around cannabis. You know, I think for those folks who spent more time in Colorado or on the West Coast, it's less so. And there's some absolutely beautiful shops out there. So I don't have any aversion to it. We haven't done a cannabis deal yet at Graffito. I'm looking forward to doing one. And I'm looking forward to doing one that, you know, is designed in a way where the landlord's parental enough to make sure it looks like a beautiful florist, not like a minute clinic, right?
But you know that the cannabis operation is not allowed to be publicly visible. So all that's visible is a waiting area.
Yeah, but you can make that waiting area beautiful. I mean, they're not growing in Colorado. They're not growing cannabis in the front of house. But if you go to Sherman Oaks or you go to, you know, drive down Valencia, like there are beautiful, beautiful cannabis shops that are just merchandised really well. I haven't seen one yet here, but a lot of municipalities are pushing them behind closed doors, forcing them to cover themselves up, and they still lines out the door, which is the wrong approach.
The state requires that, actually.
So you're probably more of an expert than I am on this, Dennis, but, you know, I'm of the opinion there's a right way of doing it, just like any retail.
I agree, but key locations to me do not make sense for the reason you said earlier. But let me just switch it to a more uplifting issue. I went to Portsmouth and Newburyport over the last few weekends, and I was shocked by how vibrant. Now, granted, it's weekends, beautiful fall weather, great New England architecture, places like we were talking about earlier, packed. And then I look at Harvard Square, which is a sad case, $200 a square foot space, that's dead. And getting back to what you were discussing with Russ, it's these places. It's a place. It's not just retail. And it's housing above and office above. It's a real community. And that's what's usually missing. Half of the Mass Avenue between Harvard Square and Porter Square is one-story buildings, which aren't going to be there forever. So making a place is absolutely key. It isn't single use, as you said. I'd like you to comment on a little further on making a place, because my sense is your work is very directly involved in that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the reason that and Russ knows this well, it's the reason that we hired somebody to lead an urban design practice at Graffito. We don't want to have an urban design practice. Like, we're not going out there and suggesting that we practice urban design, but that is so critical to creating great places. It's one of the reasons that we have a creative director now, because we need to be able to tell great stories about these places. So to your point, it's just, there's so many dimensions to it, you know, and it's a little bit scary for us. It's like, the more we learn about how to do this right, the harder it becomes, and the longer it takes. And, you know, it's just hard. We have to show discipline at Graffito, because we have to constantly remind ourselves that, like, most of the places that we all love have kind of developed in a pretty organic, amazing way. And it is really hard to fabricate these places from scratch. So, you know, we try our best. That's why some of our clients hire us. But it even leads into the architecture. You know, like, some of these districts, like, we could cluster all the retail we want. We could do all of what we're talking about. When all you have is big glass buildings, there's something about that. I think for a lot of humans, it doesn't feel the same.
I agree.
So, you know, it's just, it's so layered, it's so complicated, you know, for us. But I do think that we've been in this paradigm where so many folks, real estate developers included, their solution for placemaking was about retail. And at the end of the day, they didn't really think about placemaking as a process, but they thought about it as a result. There's a huge difference there. And, you know, a lot of our contemporaries who do retail leasing, that's a portion of our work, they think that putting a great coffee shop on a corner is placemaking.
Mhm.
That's not placemaking. That's good retail leasing and merchandising that helps to create a place, but that's not, it's totally different. So anyways, you know, yeah, I know we're at time here, but, you know, we haven't fully figured this stuff out, but at least we've kind of got our process right. And I think we're asking some of the right questions. I think we're all asking some of the right questions.
I just also wanted to add, I'm a CNU member. I think I'm up to date in my membership, but one of the nice things about these events is you see people that you've worked with that you haven't seen in a while. And I see Andre's there, and Andre's funding actually helped my getting a contract with Winchester, downtown Winchester. And we're trying to do what you just described. So thank you, Andre. I wanted to recognize you.
Andre, and I see you have your hand up, so I know we're almost out of time here. So if you want to ask and be the last question.
Okay, thanks. Might be a big one, but I'll go. So Jesse, do you see an opportunity in the softening retail market for a better mix of independent local businesses than what we've seen? A lot of these businesses have been sort of pushed out, gentrified by the immense rents over the last years. And how can, if so, you know, how can communities educate property owners about that, and what can they do to turn it into a positive?
The really short answer is yes. I mean, huge. You know, I'll find another blog post that we wrote early on about why we think there's so much opportunity, why there's reason for optimism. And again, this is layered. Like, I think from a supply chain perspective, it's the local businesses that are set up really well. I also think that, look, when we first started in this business, the way we couldn't go to developers and say, hey, do this deal with this local instead of this national, because it's the right thing to do. That does not work, right? You know, a lot of these folks, they don't care about the stuff that many of us care about, and they're not paid to care about that stuff. They got investment committees, they've got, you know, institutional investors, they're publicly traded companies, whatever it is. They've got a whole bunch of other fiduciary responsibilities. But I think what got them over the edge, and the reason I'm really optimistic that not only will these locals, the good ones, survive but thrive, is that they're way better set up to pivot right now. And I think being able to pivot right now is so hyper critical. And, you know, that's the reason we justify to our landlord clients that they should be doing deals with locals, is that they're in a situation where they can pivot, they can change, they can tweak their business models in a way that no national or regional can, or even wants to, right? So I think there's a lot of nuance to justifying these deals. I think the question then becomes, how do you lower the barriers of entry? And to your point, like bring them back into these districts where they've been priced out of. And I think the post-pandemic market is going to do some of that for us. I think that we're going to start to see many, many retail and restaurant deals go to percentage rent models. We're already seeing it happen, right? We just did a podcast with Leah Harsfeld, runs all commercial leasing for national development, right? It went live yesterday. And she talked about, this is national development, largest commercial landowner in Massachusetts. All their deals, national or local, they're going to percentage rent for F&B. And I think if that's the case for landowners, they're going to have to be really smart about the way they think about who their best partners are. And I think the smart ones are going to realize it's the local operators. And this goes back to Russ's question too. I think from a policy perspective, in terms of making more space available in the public realm, if the development and landlord community got on this, so it wasn't just the retailers pushing it, we're going to have way more success from a policy perspective. And now that the landlords are going to be economically incentivized to drive sales to their retail tenants, I think you'll see a lot of them start stepping up in ways to advocate for some of the things we're talking about that we want to see, in a way that they didn't need to get involved in advocating for a parklet. You know, you go figure that out, tenant. But when 6% of their revenue is coming back to me as my only version of rent or whatever it is, and that parklet really matters, or that loading space really matters, I think we're going to start to see a change. And I'm really hopeful the landlord and tenant interests start to align a lot more, and that alignment does the job, not wholly, of partially remedying the distance and the forces that pushed a lot of these folks out of particularly the urban context. That's my hope. And we're already starting to see it, which is great. And I'm happy to stay. I told my wife and kids I had till 7:15. So I'm also happy to stay another 10 minutes if there are folks who want to. Andre, does that resonate?
Yeah, that was a great response. Thank you.
Cool.
Okay. So I think that's really great, Jesse. Thank you so much again for coming and talking. Like we've mentioned a few times, there's lots of really great resources on Graffito's blog and their podcast. So definitely check those out. And yeah, I hope that everybody got a lot out of this. We record these talks and we put them on our CNU website. So if you think this was useful and you want to share this with your colleagues, please do that. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Please register for our summit and let us know if you have any further questions. We'd be happy to direct those to Jesse so you guys can talk offline. And once again, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm going to put my email in this if people want to reach me.
Please.
Thank you, Jesse. It was a great presentation.
Pleasure.